Whenever the people of God are under judgment and going through difficult times, going through persecution of various levels, there is always a faithful remnant who stays close to God, who stays in his word, who stays faithful to him. And we're going to look at that today, and we're going to ask ourselves the question, along with Isaiah, am I part of the faithful remnant? And what that means and what that looks like in our lives. And we'll do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your personal Bible study. And I'm here with my friend Jake Curtis, and Jake and I are going to continue in the book of Isaiah, this wonderful book. Very often when we're reading a book like Isaiah that's got a lot of prophecy in it, and it's got a lot of language that we have to really think about, it's very often that we just read through sections and we come to something we really don't understand. We'll just keep reading. And today I want to show us how we can slow down and really look at some meanings and ask ourselves the question. Now, one of the themes is the washed remnant. Okay. And we're going to ask ourselves the question, am I part of the washed remnant? And what does that mean? And who are they? And we're going to look at that today. Are you ready to get into the word?
I am, yeah.
All right. The very first thing, let's read a verse that really belongs in the last chapter. Now, the last chapter has been talking about the day that God judges Israel. And this verse 1 is really part of chapter 3, because it says, then, or because 7 women will take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread, we will wear our own clothes, only let us be called by your name and take away our reproach. Now, we can say, all right, that goes to the chapter 3. What's it talking about there? Under that day, the judgment day, and it's been talking about the judgment all of chapter 3. If you look up at chapter 3, verse 16, you get a sense of who these women are that are being judged. It talks about them being very proud and walking around with jangly jewelry to get attention and to be very haughty in the way they conduct themselves. And here it says, after the judgment, these same proud women of Israel are going to be begging for a man's protection. Now, in that day, widows didn't have a lot of services. There weren't really things available to widows that were available to married women. So very often, a woman that was a widow would look for an opportunity to remarry. But they just got done saying at the end of chapter 3 that the men of Israel were going to be killed a lot. Yeah. And therefore, that verse in chapter 4, verse 1 talks about the population is a 7-to-1 ratio. So these women are just looking for a man to take them in and take care of them. And they're saying, hey, no more of the fancy dresses and the hairdos and all that stuff. I'm going to cook and I'm going to sew my own clothes. All I need is the protection of a name and be freed from the reproach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. That does make sense.
So that's the end of that judgment, because read the first half. I'll stop you.
Okay, yeah, stop me. In that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel.
Okay, now back up. At the very beginning, what does it say?
In that day.
Yeah, okay, so it's still talking about that day that is judgment, but now there's going to be a contrast in that day of judgment. And so keep going.
Shall be beautiful and glorious.
So what's that?
In that day, the branch of the Lord shall
be. We say, okay, now wait a minute. We're just reading, and if we're not careful, we could just read through stuff. So let's stop for a second and say, who is the branch of the Lord?
Is that not Jesus?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Because a lot of people think that's Israel, but it's not. The branch of the Lord. Let me show you some verses. Turn over to Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5.
Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, capitalized, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteous in the land.
The branch is the coming king. Now, flip over in Jeremiah. Flip over to 33:15. Still in Jeremiah.
In those days, and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch, again capitalized, to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land.
Okay, so this branch is a branch of David, okay, is a descendant of David, and that branch is going to bring righteousness and judgment.
Yeah.
So we can see here that when it's talking in this verse about the branch, he's talking about the Messiah. There's also, you can also turn to Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8 says the same thing, that this is going to be a descendant of David, who's the branch of the Lord. So we can see here that it says in that day, the Messiah, okay? Now, what day? The day of judgment, right? We just been talking about that in chapter 3.
Yeah.
The day of judgment. But also in that day, there's going to be raised up a Messiah, and the Messiah will be beautiful. Now, it says in continuing that verse, it says, the Messiah is beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel. So let's break that down. What do you think it's talking about? Let's break it down after. Okay, the Messiah is going to come, and what's going to happen?
Shall be beautiful and glorious.
All right.
And the fruit of the land.
Okay, now there's a question.
Yep.
We can ask ourselves when we come to that and say, wait a minute, what's the fruit of the earth? Now, that's going to tie in to chapter 5, where it talks about the vineyard and how God expects the vineyard to produce good fruit. And we'll talk about that next week. But this idea of, because of the Messiah, the fruit of the earth will be, and then it's going to talk about that in a second. What's the fruit of the earth? If you go to John 15, verse 1, and then we're going to look at 5, but go to John 15, 1.
I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser.
Here Jesus is saying clearly, I'm the vine. The Messiah is going to produce fruit. First, it's a vine. The vine belongs to God. The vine is Jesus. And then read verse 5.
15:5.
Yeah.
I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he is that bears much fruit.
There it is.
You can do nothing.
The Messiah comes in order to bless the spiritual earth with a fruitfulness. Okay? Because now the verse continues on and it says, the fruit of the earth will produce the pride and the adornment of the survivors. Now, if we go, wait a minute, he just got done judging Israel because of its pride. And now it's saying that the Messiah is going to produce pride. Let's go back to Jeremiah again. And it talks about Israel's boast, Israel's pride, and what should be Israel's pride. Jeremiah 9:24.
But let him who boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord.
So as the Messiah, as the Lord, he produces a pride, a boasting in the fact that we know him and we understand that he's a God of loving kindness, righteousness, and justice on the earth. So you can see when it's talking about this pride of the survivors of Israel, those who are still left out of the judgment that just came. This pride is a spiritual pride in knowing Messiah.
Okay, I can see that.
Okay. One of the questions we can ask ourselves, is, do I have a pride or a fruit that produces a boasting in the fact that I know the Lord? Not boasting in the fact of bragging, but boasting in the fact of glory. In fact, that's what the word boast means. It means to glory in. So the Lord comes, the Messiah comes, and he's beautiful and he's glorious in the midst of this judgment on that day. And he gives the earth this fruitfulness of the joy and pride and glory of knowing him. And it's an adornment of the survivors of Israel. Now, there's a principle here that we see throughout history, and that is no matter how bad the persecution of the church gets, and the church is going to go through a number of persecutions, God's people are going to be persecuted to death often, and Christians are persecuted. Always in the midst of persecution, God reserves a faithful remnant. He saves and protects. We're going to see that in a second. He protects a smaller group of people that are faithful to the Messiah. Okay? And so this idea of there's going to be survivors, and those survivors are going to be blessed. And it will come about, in verse 3, it will come about that he who is left in Zion, these are the survivors, and remains in Jerusalem, they'll be called holy. That's this remnant that are staying faithful. They're holy because of that stance of, I'm going to be faithful to the Messiah, the beautiful and glorious Messiah. You see where we're going?
Yeah.
Okay. Is this making sense to what these verses are saying?
Yeah, he packs a lot in just 2 sentences.
Yeah. And it's important for us to know that in the midst of God's judgment, where he's judging sin, always has his eye out for the faithful remnant. There's always a group of people. The Dark Ages, when they were killing Christians and drowning them and burning them at the stake and everything else, there was always this small group of faithful people that stayed true to God's word, true to the Bible, true to Jesus. Okay? So that's just a historical fact. And then he says that everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem, that to me, that goes back to this idea of recorded in the book of life, right? If your name is recorded in the book of life. And it says, if everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem, in other words, this faithful remnant that is still alive in Jerusalem, even after or even during God's judgment. The Lord has washed. So now he's talking about people that are recorded for life. When the Lord washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning. Now what do you think? What do you think that verse is saying?
Washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion. So obviously getting rid of purging, and just like they talked about, God could take it out.
The Lord in his judgment is going to wash away the filth. Now, there's a couple of interesting verses. I want to go to the New Testament and talk about this idea of being washed. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11.
It was right before 2 Corinthians.
Yeah, go to 2 Corinthians and turn left.
Yep. And such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, and you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ by the Spirit of our God.
Now, the verse before that talks about living in sin, that they used to live in sin. And he says, such were like you, but you've been washed. Okay. Now, look at Titus chapter 3, verse 5.
He saved us not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy, by the washing of generation and renewal of the Holy Spirit.
Now, this is very interesting because one of the questions I asked at the beginning of this lesson is, are you washed? Are you part of the washed remnant? Are you part of this faithful group that has stayed, even through judgment, has stayed faithful to the Lord? Now, then he says something very interesting in that same verse. Read the rest of that verse, Jake, about after they're washed.
When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the blood stains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning.
Okay. Now we can ask ourselves a very interesting question when we're studying this. What is the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning? Now he's talking about the context. He's talking about a faithful remnant who have survived, correct? Because they've
Correct.
been washed.
Yep.
And how they've been washed is very interesting here because there's two aspects of God washing Jerusalem. One is with judgment and one is with fire. Now, judgment is judging sin, the filthiness of the daughters of Zion, this prideful sin. And judgment is for the non-believer who is being dealt with in order to convince that non-believer that God really is an answer to them and they need to be saved from this judgment. But the other is a spirit of fire. Now, what do you think? What do you think he's talking about?
I would think that's the Holy Spirit as cleansing your spirit.
Okay. Now, if you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we see an example of this. Look at verse 12 through 15, because it's talking about this very thing, this judgment with the spirit of fire.
Okay. Now, if anyone builds a foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer a loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire.
I love that because it really talks about people. In fact, Christ is their foundation. So these are believers.
Yeah.
And it depends upon what they build in their life, what they build on gold, silver, and jewels, or do they waste their time and build on straw and nothing? But it says their lives on the foundation of Messiah, their lives are going to be tested with fire. See what lasts. And it says that fire, this is not a fire for judgment of salvation or not. They're saved. In fact, he says, after it's judged by fire and everything burns up, they're still saved, but as by fire.
Right.
So this is an important thing. So these two spirits that it's talking about in Isaiah is the spirit of judgment for the non-believer and the spirit of fire to test the believer to get that purified result. Okay?
That's interesting.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I can totally see that.
So God's judgment always has two parts to it. There's always a part that's judging the non-believer and the sin of the non-believing culture. But then there's a part of judgment that's really a test of the faithful believers to see if tested by fire, they come out pure in motivation and in action as a fruitful, washed, faithful remnant. Yeah. So there's always two parts of judgment. So asking ourselves the question, we're going through tough times. Is this trying to get me to become a believer? Or is this trying to get me to be purified and tested as a believer to come out more mature? That's why James says, count it all joy when you encounter various trials, because in the perseverance of those trials, it'll produce maturity, steadfastness, faithfulness. So let's go back. This is a promise that God has a silver lining in this judgment, and the silver lining is based upon the person of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, and that he will come and he will wash away sin, and he will judge non-believers and he'll judge believers with burning. Then the Lord, so we're back to he is taking this action. He will create over the whole area of Mount Zion, over her assemblies, a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. Over all the glory will be a canopy. Now, what does that remind you of?
Was that Moses in Exodus?
Exactly right. And what God was doing with the cloud during the day and the pillar of fire at night, he was leading Israel, and they were to follow his presence as a symbol of Shekinah glory. And that's this, over all the glory will be a canopy. God is going to be a canopy. Now, the last part to here is, this is great. And it's going to be a canopy There will be a shelter to give shade from the heat by day and refuge and protection from the storm and the rain. Now, that word protection I have in my notes here. The Lord is going to be a hiding place. That's what this word protection means. He's going to put a shelter over his faithful remnant, and they'll be tested, but they're not going to lose. They're not going to be lost because God has a protection over them. And he's going to shade them from the heat of the day and from the storm and from the rain. And so this is this idea of God is going to be there for his faithful remnant, a shelter from the heat of judgment, the shelter of the storm of judgment, the shelter of the rain in our lives where it just seems like hard times are raining down. If we remember always that we are part of the fruitful, faithful remnant, depending on the Lord, looking to him, trusting in him, God will take care of us. And our names will be written in Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem, and be written in life. So what do you think?
There was a lot in just those, what was that? Six verses?
6 lousy verses. You go, I'll read this real fast. And you read it and you go, wait a minute. If we really slow down and we look and see, what is he talking about? And so if you didn't get who the branch was, you would miss all the meaning.
Yeah, I remember when I first started reading that, I read that verse 2 probably 3 or 4 times before I realized that the branch was not Israel, because they're talking about the survivors of Israel. So how can you talk about Israel if they're,
the branch who is the branch who has under it these survivors. I'm the vine, you are the branches. The offshoots of this branch is believers. But if you miss that, if you just read over that, chapter 4 just doesn't mean anything. You miss all of it. And you miss leading up to the next chapter, 5, is talking about the vineyard. And it's talking about Israel under the judgment is showing itself not to be faithful and not to be a good remnant. And we'll see that next week. Any other comments? Did you enjoy this? We went deep today.
We did. You needed to learn to talk about everything that was in there, to understand, fully comprehend what was there. I think that was good.
That's why we use a concordance and look up terms, and we look at the references on the side of the study Bible, and pay attention, slow down, read those verses, and it'll reveal a lot.
Yeah. The word canopy is often referred to as the bridegroom would bring his canopy. And more symbology.
I didn't think about that, but that's true. The idea of the canopy is God's protection over the covenant marriage. It was a picture of God's protection, and the canopy was going to be God's protection over his people, the faithful remnant. So asking ourselves the question, am I part of the washed remnant? Have I been washed? Am I part of the fruitful remnant of God who depends upon Jesus? It's a great question and something to really think about as we go. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called Forgiveness Kills Your Guilt. It's out of a new series that I just recently did, and I think it'll be a blessing to you. And listen, we're going to continue our study in Isaiah next week. And until then, God bless you.